On the New Mexico frontier, there was a time when families survived on simple meals that have almost disappeared from the table today. Recipes shaped by the desert, by ingenuity, and by knowledge that didn't come from factories, but from lived experience. Number 8 was a grain so valuable it was suppressed for centuries. Number 2 combined a food from the landscape with a surprisingly stable source of energy. And number 1 transformed ordinary corn into something far more nourishing than most people today would imagine. These 13 meals weren't just tradition, they were survival, and almost no one remembers them anymore. 13. Atole de maíz blanco. There was a time when something as simple as a bowl of corn could determine whether a family thrived or slowly broke down from hidden malnutrition. On the New Mexico frontier, atole de maíz blanco wasn't just food. It was survival disguised as comfort. Thick, warm, and deeply satisfying, it filled the stomach quickly. But what most people today would completely miss is this. It carried a secret process that modern diets have almost entirely abandoned. And without that process, corn becomes a shadow of what it once was. The difference came from nixtamalization, a method so old it feels almost accidental, yet so powerful it transformed corn into a complete nutritional source. By soaking the maize in lime or wood ash, frontier families unlocked vitamin B3 and made its protein actually usable by the human body. Without it, people risked serious deficiencies. With it, they could live, work, and endure harsh conditions on what looked like the simplest meal imaginable. Compare that to modern corn products, cornflakes, corn syrup, and processed snacks, and you start to see the gap. What we eat today may look similar, but it no longer carries the same biological power. And that's what makes atole so fascinating and so forgotten. It wasn't lost because it didn't work. It disappeared because convenience replaced knowledge. The slow preparation, the cultural understanding, and the patience all faded. What remains is a watered-down version of corn that fills calories but not needs. Frontier families didn't just eat to survive the day. They ate in a way that quietly built resilience over years. And atole de maíz blanco was one of their most underestimated tools. 12. Salt-rising bread. The fermentation secret. Imagine baking bread without yeast and still watching it rise. That alone sounds strange. But what's even more unsettling and fascinating is what actually made it happen. Salt-rising bread depended on a wild, unpredictable bacterium pulled straight from the environment. No packets, no store-bought cultures, just air, cornmeal, and time. And the result? A loaf with a smell people described as almost cheesy, even slightly pungent. Not exactly what modern tastes expect, but exactly what made it unforgettable. The secret lies in Clostridium perfringens, a naturally occurring bacteria that thrives in warm conditions. Frontier families didn't know its scientific name, but they understood its behavior. They nurtured it carefully, creating the right environment for fermentation to take hold. Unlike modern bread, which relies on controlled, predictable yeast, this process was alive, temperamental, and even risky if done wrong. But when done right, it produced a texture and depth of flavor that industrial baking has never been able to replicate. It was dense yet airy, complex yet comforting. So why did it disappear? Not because it lacked value, but because it couldn't be standardized. In a world that began to favor consistency, speed, and safety regulations, salt-rising bread became too unpredictable to survive. Its very strength, its wild, living nature, became its downfall. Today, most people have never even heard of it. But on the frontier, it represented something deeper than bread. It was a connection to the invisible world of microbes, long before science explained them. A reminder that food wasn't always controlled, it was cultivated. 11. Cuilites con frijoles. Right now, in deserts and empty fields, there are plants growing that most people would walk past without a second thought. Or worse, rip out as weeds. But to frontier families, those same plants were essential. Cuilites, wild greens like lamb's quarters, weren't a backup plan. They were a cornerstone of daily nutrition. And when paired with beans, they created a meal that was far more powerful than it looked. These weeds were incredibly rich in iron, omega-3 fatty acids, and micronutrients that modern diets often struggle to provide. In fact, many of them surpass kale, the vegetable people today consider a superfood. But unlike farmed greens, quelites didn't require cultivation. They grew naturally, resilient against harsh climates, offering free and abundant nourishment to anyone who knew how to recognize them. That knowledge was the real currency. Without it, the land looked empty. With it, it became a living pantry. Over time, that knowledge faded. Industrial agriculture replaced foraging, supermarkets replaced landscapes, and foods like quelites quietly disappeared from family tables. What's left is a strange irony. People now pay premium prices for cultivated greens, while ignoring wild plants that are often more nutritious. Quelites con frijoles wasn't just a meal. It was a system of awareness, a way of seeing value where others saw nothing. And once that way of seeing was lost, so was the food itself. Before continuing, don't forget to subscribe and like to keep discovering the strange and incredible flavors of our forgotten American history. 10. Son of a gun stew. Most people today wouldn't even consider eating what went into this stew. And that's exactly why it existed. On the New Mexico frontier, wasting food wasn't an option. It was a liability. Son of a gun stew came from a mindset that modern diets have almost completely erased. Every part of the animal had value. Not just the muscle meat, but the organs, the marrow, even the parts most people now avoid without thinking twice. What sounds extreme today was once the difference between strength and slow decline. At the center of this dish was something rarely talked about now: the marrow gut. Rich in fats, enzymes, and nutrients that don't exist in lean cuts of meat, it provided a kind of deep nourishment that modern eating habits often miss. Frontier families didn't chase low-fat diets. They relied on dense, sustaining energy that could carry them through long days of labor, exposure, and uncertainty. This stew wasn't about flavor alone. It was about extracting every possible benefit from a single animal, stretching its value across multiple meals while delivering essential nutrients the body actually needed. But as food systems industrialized, that philosophy disappeared. Meat became standardized, trimmed, and simplified into familiar cuts. The rest was discarded, forgotten, or turned into something unrecognizable. Son of a gun stew didn't vanish because it failed. It vanished because abundance changed perception. What was once seen as resourceful became seen as undesirable. And in that shift, an entire category of nutrient-rich eating quietly faded from everyday life. 9. Pinole Power Cakes. There are stories of frontier scouts traveling over 50 miles in a single day, with almost nothing to eat. No heavy supplies, no constant meals, just a small pouch of something that looked almost too simple to matter. That something was pinole. Ground, toasted maize mixed with water or honey, pressed into dense cakes that could fit in the palm of your hand. It didn't look impressive, but it carried a kind of sustained energy that modern snack foods still struggle to replicate. The secret wasn't just in the ingredients, it was in the preparation. Toasting the maize changed its structure, making it easier to digest while concentrating its energy. Combined with natural sugars or simply water, it became a slow-burning fuel source rather than a quick spike and crash. Frontier travelers didn't have the luxury of stopping constantly to eat. They needed something that worked with their bodies, not against them. And pinole delivered exactly that: steady endurance, minimal weight, and maximum efficiency. Today, energy bars and performance snacks try to recreate that same effect, often with long ingredient lists and synthetic additives. But pinole did it with almost nothing. And yet, it faded away. Not because it lacked effectiveness, but because it lacked marketing, convenience packaging, and mass production appeal. It belonged to a time when people understood how to fuel their bodies through experience, not labels. And once that understanding disappeared, so did one of the most efficient survival foods ever used. 8. Capirotada, frontier style. At first glance, capirotada might seem like just another dessert, sweet, comforting, maybe even indulgent. But on the frontier, it was something entirely different. This wasn't just a treat. It was a carefully constructed survival meal, designed to turn leftover bread into something dense, nourishing, and long-lasting. Every ingredient had a purpose, and nothing was wasted. What looked like simplicity on the surface was actually a clever system hidden in plain sight. Frontier-style capirotada combined aged cheese, nuts, spices, and hardened bread into a dish that balanced sweet and savory in a way modern recipes rarely attempt. The aged cheese added protein and fat. The nuts contributed additional calories and nutrients. The spices weren't just for flavor, they helped preserve the dish and enhance its complexity. And the bread, often stale and unusable on its own, became the foundation that held everything together. In a time when food preservation was critical, this dish extended the life of ingredients that would otherwise be lost. Over time, capirotada was redefined. It became sweeter, lighter, and more of a dessert than a necessity. And in that transformation, its original purpose faded. What was once a high-calorie strategic meal became something occasional and symbolic. But the frontier version tells a different story, one of adaptation, creativity, and survival. It shows how families didn't just cook meals, they engineered them to last, to nourish, and to make the most out of very little. 7. Panocha, sprouted wheat pudding. This is one of the most time-consuming foods on the entire frontier list. And that's exactly why it mattered so much. Panocha wasn't something you could rush. It required patience, attention, and a deep understanding of transformation. Families would take whole wheat and let it sprout slowly in darkness, allowing something almost invisible to happen, starches breaking down into natural sugars. What started as a basic grain became something alive, changing at a biochemical level long before anyone could explain it scientifically. As the wheat sprouted, enzymes activated, unlocking nutrients that would otherwise remain trapped. The flavor shifted too, becoming naturally sweet without needing added sugar. When cooked into a thick pudding, panocha delivered more than just calories. It offered a kind of nourishment that modern processed grains simply don't provide. Today, most wheat products are stripped, refined, and accelerated through production. But panocha followed the opposite path. Slow, deliberate, and deeply rooted in biological processes that worked with the body instead of overwhelming it. So why did it disappear? Because it demanded too much time in a world that began to value speed above all else. Sprouting grain in darkness for days doesn't fit into industrial systems or modern routines. But in losing panocha, something bigger was lost. The understanding that food could be transformed before it was even cooked. That nourishment could begin long before the first bite. It wasn't just a dish. It was a process. And once that process was forgotten, the food went with it. 6. Amaranth porridge, alegre, the banned item. There's a reason this food carries a reputation that sounds almost forbidden. For centuries, amaranth wasn't just ignored, it was actively suppressed. Not because it was harmful, but because of what it represented. It held deep cultural and ritual significance among indigenous communities, and that made it a target. But behind that history lies something even more surprising. Nutritionally, amaranth is one of the most complete grains you can eat. Unlike most grains, which are missing key amino acids, amaranth contains lysine, a crucial building block for protein that's almost entirely absent in staples like wheat or corn. That made it incredibly valuable on the frontier, where balanced nutrition wasn't guaranteed. Cooked into a porridge or formed into simple preparations like alegre, it provided a rare combination of protein, minerals, and sustained energy. It wasn't just filling, it was structurally complete in a way few plant-based foods are. And yet, despite all of that, it nearly vanished. Cultural suppression, shifting agricultural priorities, and the rise of more commercially viable crops pushed it to the margins. Today, it's slowly making a comeback, often labeled as a superfood. But that label barely scratches the surface. Amaranth wasn't new. It was rediscovered. And its disappearance wasn't accidental. It was the result of history, power, and changing systems that decided which foods survived and which were left behind. 5. Wild oregano and chili broth. Long before pharmacies and antibiotics, survival often depended on something far less obvious: what you could brew in a pot. Wild oregano and chili broth wasn't just a meal, it was a form of frontier medicine. When illness spread or infections threatened, families turned to what they had, and what they had was knowledge of the land. This simple broth carried compounds that modern science would later recognize as powerful. But back then, people only knew one thing: it worked. Wild oregano contains carvacrol, a natural compound with strong antimicrobial properties. Combined with chili, which stimulates circulation and helps the body respond to stress, the broth became more than nourishment. It became defense. In harsh environments where medical help was distant or non-existent, this kind of knowledge wasn't optional, it was essential. A warm bowl could soothe, protect, and support the body in ways that went far beyond basic nutrition. Over time, as modern medicine advanced, these kinds of remedies were pushed aside, not because they were ineffective, but because they were replaced by faster, standardized solutions. But something important shifted in that transition. The connection between food and healing became weaker. Wild oregano and chili broth represents a time when that connection was direct, immediate, and deeply understood. It wasn't labeled as medicine, but for those who relied on it, it absolutely was. 4. Jerky gravy, tasajo. It sounds almost contradictory. How do you turn something dry, tough, and built to last into a rich, satisfying meal? That was the challenge frontier families solved with jerky gravy. Dried meat, or tasajo, was essential for preservation. It could last weeks, even months. But eating it as is wasn't always practical, especially for families needing to stretch every resource. So they found a way to bring it back to life and make it go further than anyone would expect. The process was simple but incredibly effective. The jerky was pounded down into a fine powder, then slowly rehydrated with lard and flour to create a thick, hearty gravy. What started as a small amount of preserved meat could suddenly feed an entire family over multiple meals. The fats from the lard added energy, the flour created bulk, and the meat provided flavor and protein. It wasn't just about taste, it was about efficiency. Every bite carried more value than it seemed. Today, preservation looks very different. Refrigeration and mass production have made long-lasting food almost invisible to us. But in that shift, the ingenuity behind meals like jerky gravy faded away. This wasn't just a recipe, it was a strategy. A way to stretch limited resources without sacrificing nourishment. And once food became abundant, that kind of thinking slowly disappeared, along with the meals that depended on it. Remember to subscribe to the channel, because many of these foods are disappearing. And with them, a part of history you may still remember. 3. Vinegar pie. Imagine craving something fresh, something bright and acidic, in a place where fruit simply didn't exist. No lemons, no apples, no citrus of any kind. Just dry land and limited supplies. And yet, frontier families still managed to recreate that missing flavor. Vinegar pie sounds strange at first, almost like actually a clever solution to a very real problem: how to balance a diet that would otherwise feel heavy, dull, and incomplete. Because after weeks of eating dense foods, your body doesn't just want variety, it starts to need it. By combining vinegar with sugar, spices like nutmeg, and a simple crust, they created something that mimicked the taste of lemon pie. Not perfectly, but enough to satisfy that craving for acidity that the body instinctively seeks. That balance mattered more than people realize. Diets heavy in grains, meats, and fats can feel overwhelming without contrast. Over time, that lack of brightness doesn't just affect taste, it affects appetite, mood, even digestion. Vinegar pie brought that contrast back, offering a small but meaningful sense of freshness in an environment that rarely provided it naturally. And there's something almost psychological about it too. In a harsh, repetitive environment, flavor becomes more than taste, it becomes relief. A break from monotony, a reminder that food can still surprise you. Vinegar pie wasn't just filling a nutritional gap, it was restoring a sense of normalcy, even comfort, in a place where both were hard to come by. It gave families something familiar, even when nothing around them was. Over time, as transportation improved and fresh ingredients became widely available, there was no longer a need to simulate these flavors. Real fruit replaced ingenuity, and vinegar pie quietly disappeared, becoming more of a curiosity than a staple. But it tells a powerful story about adaptation, the ability to recreate what's missing using only what's available. It wasn't just about dessert. It was about solving a nutritional and psychological gap in a way that feels almost invisible today. And once that kind of creativity is no longer necessary, it slowly fades, along with the dishes that depended on it. 2. Nopalitos con huevo. At first glance, Cactus doesn't seem like something you'd want to eat regularly, let alone depend on. But on the New Mexico frontier, nopalitos, prickly pear cactus pads, were a reliable, accessible, and incredibly functional food. Paired with eggs, they became a simple yet powerful meal that supported energy levels in ways people are only now beginning to fully understand. What looked like a humble dish was actually a quiet advantage in harsh conditions, one that worked in the background without drawing attention to itself. Modern research confirms something frontier families already knew through experience. Nopalitos help regulate blood sugar. In an environment where long hours of physical labor were unavoidable, that kind of stability was crucial. Spikes and crashes in energy weren't just uncomfortable, they were dangerous. You couldn't afford to slow down halfway through the day. Combined with eggs, which provided protein and fats, this dish created a steady, sustained fuel source that could carry someone through an entire morning of work without fatigue setting in too quickly. But there's another layer to it: hydration and resilience. Nopalitos naturally retain water and contain compounds that support the body under stress, something incredibly valuable in dry, unforgiving climates. This wasn't just food that filled you up. It helped your body handle the environment itself. And that's a level of function most modern meals don't even attempt to reach. Today, we often separate food from performance, but on the frontier, they were the same thing. So why isn't it more common today? Part of it comes down to perception. Cactus feels unfamiliar, even intimidating to people removed from that environment. And as diets became more standardized, foods tied to specific regions or traditions began to fade. But nopalitos con huevo represents something deeper than just a meal. It shows how closely people once paid attention to how food affected their bodies, not through studies, but through lived experience. And in that awareness, they found solutions that modern diets are only starting to rediscover, piece by piece. 1. Chicos, Oaxacan sun-dried corn. It's easy to overlook corn. It's everywhere, canned, processed, and mass-produced to the point where it feels almost ordinary. But Chicos were anything but ordinary. This wasn't just corn pulled from a field and stored away. It went through a slow, deliberate transformation that completely changed its flavor, texture, and nutritional depth. And once you understand that process, you start to realize how much has been lost in the way we handle food today. Because this wasn't about speed, it was about letting time do something you couldn't rush. Frontier families would harvest the corn while still tender, then steam it inside its husk in outdoor hornos. Earth ovens that trapped heat and smoke in a way modern kitchens simply don't replicate. That slow steaming process did something remarkable. It began to caramelize the natural sugars inside the corn, infusing it with a subtle smokiness while preserving its structure. After that, the corn was dried under the sun, locking in both flavor and longevity. What emerged wasn't just preserved food, it was something entirely new. Richer, deeper, more complex than anything you'd find in a can. But what makes Chicos truly stand out is how layered the process was. Steam, smoke, sun, each step added something different, building flavor in stages instead of all at once. It's the opposite of how modern food works, where everything is accelerated and simplified. Here, nothing was skipped. And because of that, the final result carried a depth that felt earned. It wasn't just food. It was the result of patience, environment, and intention working together. But like so many of these foods, Chicos didn't disappear because they lacked value. They disappeared because they required time, space, and patience. 3 things modern systems try to eliminate. Today, corn is processed for efficiency, stripped down for consistency, and packaged for convenience. But in that transformation, the depth is gone. The slow-built flavor, the layered preparation, the connection to the land, it all fades. Chicos weren't just a way to preserve corn. They were a reminder that food could evolve, that it could become more through time and care. And once that mindset disappeared, so did one of the most flavorful and meaningful staples of the frontier. After rediscovering these 13 forgotten family meals from the New Mexico frontier, we'd love to hear your opinion. Which of these dishes would you most like to see returned to the table today? Tell us in the comments, and let's see how many of us choose the same one. And speaking of remembering, the best choice you can make right now is to watch the video appearing on your screen and keep rediscovering the real American food history that's slowly being forgotten. But before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video. See you in the next one.